and all the wonderful things that he was doing. The gospel of the Lord. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Again, it's a privilege and a pleasure to be here. And let's pause for a moment and reflect on these readings and see how they might connect with who we are and who our God might be for us. So Jesus is at work. He's a rabbi. So he's teaching in the synagogue, and they meet on the Sabbath day. And while he is doing this, a woman who's been crippled for 18 years, bent over, not able to stand up straight, and all that might signify both physically and emotionally. And Jesus sees her, and he touches her. He lays his hand on her and sets her free. And she can stand up straight and hold her head up high and move forward. Jesus has done his work. But the leader of the synagogue goes nuts. He said, it's the Sabbath. This woman could come any day of the week, but she comes on the Sabbath and seeks to be cured. And Jesus says, you hypocrites. Isn't this my work? And isn't that our work? Don't you feed your animals and take care of them on the Sabbath day? Isn't that what I should be doing? And isn't that what she should be doing? And then in a troublable statement for me, it says that those leaders and those who were criticizing him were put to shame. I'm not sure that we should be put to shame, but there are times when we might be criticized, because that shame somehow brings divisions one to another, and not only am I right and you're wrong, but I am the right person and you are a wrong person. But nonetheless, they go forward in faith, but also kind of, what does this mean? Asking these questions of who gets to stand up straight and who doesn't, and who am I and who are you, and what is our identity in relationship to this God? Norman Maclean, who wrote A River Comes Through It, that's so famous with Robert Redford fly fishing and all that, wrote at one point that, let me get it right, the problem of self-identity is not just a problem of the young. It is a problem of all time. Perhaps it is the problem. It should haunt old age, and no longer does it tell, and it no longer tells you that, then you should probably are dead. If you are not haunted by that problem of self-identity, your life isn't meaning much or going much of anywhere. That Hebrews lesson was hard when we start asking that question of self-identity and who we are and who this God is. For we get a sense of who we are in relationship to our sense of who God is. And the question is not, do you believe in God? The question is much more, what kind of God do you believe in? So in the book of Hebrews, it says, you have not come to a place that is of untouchable things, of fire and of storm and of wrath, but also of voice and also of storm and also of sunlight. You have not come to these things that are untouchable, which were like that holy mountain that even the animals couldn't touch and not die. The mountain that Moses goes to and he shakes with fear and trembling. to enter into the holiness of God, a God of such power, a God of such fire, that it drives one to their knees and leaves them in such terror. But the book of Hebrews says, you have come rather to another mountain. You have come to Mount Zion. You have come to the mountain of peace, where you are welcome, where you are to be embraced, where you are to know that this is a God whose voice is to be heard and to be nurtured and to be accepted. But there's a trick there, isn't it? Because the voice is not something you can really touch. And it's not something you can fully comprehend. But it's something that you know is as real and as true as the wind and the fire. That you can't totally grasp it, but somehow you have a sense of the presence of the living God. And so it ends it ends that passage by saying, and thus it is. We approach this God with awe and reverence and thanksgiving. We approach this God who touches us in such a way of grace. But truly, our God is an unquenchable fire. An unquenchable fire. So who is this God? Is it this God who is unapproachable and this God who drives us to our knees? Or is it this God who touches us and shows compassion in a different way? And is the compassion of God one that surrounds us with loving arms like a parent? Or is it a God who says, you go that way, you're headed for trouble, just like a parent might do? But both of those words of compassion, both of love, words which surround us on every side. This fellow, Norman McLean, that I was referring to, he was from Montana. He was a wilderness man. But he's also a professor of English at the University of Chicago. And he was always riding that difference. And as a young man, he had been fighting a forest fire when on the next mountain there had been a huge forest fire that went amok. And off the Missouri River up what they called Man Gulch, there had been a small fire, and so the Forest Service had let down 15 people, 14 young men and their supervisor. And they were just fighting a routine fire when all of a sudden something went amiss. The wind shifted, and it came in just right. And the greenery and the undergrowth was such that it all sparked in not just forest fire, but in a firestorm, a perfect storm. And it rushed up the gulch, and they all ran. And 2 of them made it to the crest of the mountain and came down the other side and were fine. 12 of them didn't make it and perished. And the supervisor, he hadn't thought of it before, and he doesn't know why he came to it, but he had some paper matches. And he got the paper matches, and he built a little bitty fire, like a backfire. And he called them all over to say, come with me. And one of them stopped and saw what he was doing, and he said, to heck with that. And he ran up the hill and burned. But this one man, as the storm came, dove into the ashes of the backfire. Literally dove into them as the storm went rushing over him. And he lived. Norman McLean came to that site the next day while the smoke was still smoldering and walked around, and it haunted him the rest of his life. It haunted him with those questions of how and why and what if and who. So he spent, in many ways, the rest of his life with that question of, why not me? And these questions of self-identification. And part of it was just objective. What was science doing and what was creation doing that there were these dry plants and there was this big wind and there was this gulch and there were these 12 people and it all went whooshing up and killed them all? What were the scientific elements that made that come together? And what was the background of all these people? And what led them to be in that place, in that time, and what was their psyche, and who were their relatives, and what was their health like, and what put them together to make this happen to them? What were the facts there? And these two that were able to outrun the fire, what kind of strength did they have that made them ability to do that? And what was their background that gave them that ability? And how did they happen to be in the place where they could outrun that fire? And then this one guy who built the backfire, how was he able to get those matches and move that quickly to build that backfire? And how did that backfire actually stop those flames from getting him as well? But just these objective questions. What is going on here? Let's get the facts down. But then he went on another level too, sort of that level of purpose, that question of more, why on a human and divine level? You know, in the first covenant made by the good Lord and Abraham and Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Leah and Rachel, the idea was you have these 10 commandments. I love the 10 commandments, and they're sort of these fence around which we say we have this covenant with God, and here are our directions on how we follow. And to protect that fence, we make another fence and another fence. And so we have all these rules to keep us from remembering the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Thou shalt do no murder. And if we don't do that, our covenant with God gets shaken and life is difficult. So that woman who couldn't stand up straight, what did she do? Surely she did something to be punished by God that she couldn't stand up straight. And if it wasn't her, it must have been her parents. And if it hadn't been her parents, maybe this was God's test for her to see if she was a righteous woman. You may like all those arguments. I have trouble with them. But for those 12 men, what had they done to be killed? Had they not taken care of their bodies? Had they been mean to their mother? Had they stolen or coveted? Was this God's vengeance? Was this God's wrath? Was this God physically and ultimately shaming them behind all measure? What had they done? What had they done? And those two who were able to outrace the fire, had they been good people? Had they obeyed their mother and eaten the right food and been healthy enough to speed up the hill? Had they just lucked out? Had they been somehow touched by grace where the other 12 had not? How do we determine who is the recipient of grace and who is not, and what do the results of that look like? And how does it go on in this life, and how does this go on even beyond that? Who is this God who touches us with love? And who is this God who sets some parameters who say, if you want me to be your God, you need to be my people. And here's some instructions about how to keep that covenant with me. But don't forget, this is a God who loves me beyond all measure. This is a God who remembers us when we're even in the womb and before that. But this is a God who is also a burning fire. So the love of God encompasses both compassion and forgiveness, and hearkening to pay attention to. You know, it's interesting. Norman Maclean never finished that book. And probably for good reason. Because there's no answer to any of those questions. Those are those questions that we perhaps ponder as we see through a glass darkly. And someday we'll get to know face to face. And for the rest of his days, Maclean walked in Man Gulch off the Missouri River. And he'd go there as an old man and walk up and walk down. And in every place where those 12 young men had died, there was a concrete cross. And Maclean would go to each cross and ponder this person's life. And he likened it to walking the way of the cross. And how do we walk the way of the cross and find it to be none other than the way of life and of peace? So here we are on Sunday morning. I mean, you all could be at the gym. You know? You'd be reading the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. You know? So you're here. I don't think you're here because it has the best coffee or the best treats on little doilies. You know? But we're here also in some way sort of, I hope also on that search for identity. And somehow finding our own identity rooted in this identity of who we see our God to be. And I hope that we are here as a community struggling to say, how was I also the beloved of God? And how I am also the beloved of God. And how will I always be the beloved of God? And who is this God with whom I link? Because it's not just crosses on a hillside. It is the cross of Christ on that hill of Zion, that place that welcomes us so. You know. And how do we go forward in that faith and fear? And my hope and expectation and assumption and knowledge is that within that struggle, you also see this sense of the belovedness of your own lives and the belovedness of God that equips you to go forward in faith and fear, giving as you receive, and also rejoicing in such a way that you have the courage to keep asking those questions and to keep walking that hill and to keep saying, who is this God and how can this be? Because I live with a God who is a consuming fire and a God who touches me that I might stand up straight and be healed. So Maclean never finished the book, but towards the end of his life, he wrote what could possibly have been a preface or a conclusion for us all. And he said, as I get considerably beyond the biblical allotment of 70 years and 10, I feel with increasing intensity that I can express my gratitude for still being around on the oxygen side of the earth's crust only by not standing pat on what I have hitherto known and loved. While the oxygen lasts, there are still new things to love, especially if compassion is a form of love. It's worth reading again. You remember this now. Don't forget it, okay? As I get considerably beyond the biblical allotment of 70 years and 10, I feel with increasing intensity that I can express myself and my gratitude for still being around on the oxygen side of the earth's crust only by not standing pat on what I have hitherto known and loved. While the oxygen lasts, there are still new things to love, especially if compassion is a form of love. So sometimes we must sit still and wait for the Spirit to touch us and spur us on. And other times we must simply take that plunge into the ashes to save our very souls. Amen. As we stand for the Nicene Creed, I ask that we join together and read it in its entirety. Please rise. We believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, maker of heaven and earth,